Hi everyone, we are Team 23 and we are here to present the UK inflation dynamics from November 2021 to October 2022 and its policy responses since then. This period, marked by significant economic and geopolitical upheaval, offers a rich canvas to understand the complex forces driving inflation in the contemporary global landscape. In 2021 and 2022, there's a significant rise in inflation in the UK. The increase became more pronounced as rates crossed the 5% mark in November 2021. This trend continued upward, with inflation reaching a high of 11.1% by October 2022. We're going to analyze the core factors contributing to inflation in the following parts, and we'll focus our discussion on the Consumer Price Index, i.e., the CPI, as a key indicator. We have identified several causes of inflation in the UK: the inflation expectations, Ukraine-Russia conflict, the COVID-19 effect, and currency depreciation. So first of all, the inflation expectations shaped by uncertainty and recent negative shocks like COVID-19 and the Ukraine-Russia conflict have led to a cycle of anticipatory behavior among the public. This anticipation of inflation drives demands for higher wages as the individuals seek to offset expected price increases. The pervasive pessimism amongst consumers fueled by these events and ongoing inflation creates a self-fulfilling prophecy. The public's inflationary expectations contribute directly to inflation's rise. This mechanism of expectation-driven inflation will be further illustrated as we progress through the presentation, clarifying how anticipatory actions in response to economic signals can amplify inflationary pressures. The Ukraine-Russia conflict has significantly impacted UK economics, notably through its effect on energy markets. This geopolitical event disrupted energy supplies, leading to a mismatch between energy supply and demand, therefore pushing up the energy price. Given the critical role of energy prices in the Consumer Price Index, i.e. the CPI, this imbalance directly escalated the inflation rate. The rise in energy prices not only increased the cost of living for consumers, but also influenced broader economic indicators, showcasing the direct linkage between geopolitical instability and inflationary pressures in the global economy.
In response to COVID-19, the UK government and the Bank of England implemented emergency economic measures, including a fiscal spending surge to £310 to £410 billion. Also, the Bank of England lowered its interest rates from 0.75% to an unprecedented 0.1% in March 2020 to enhance liquidity and reduce borrowing costs. These actions, combined with supply chain disruptions and spikes in energy costs, contributed to price increase across sectors, which accelerated inflation. As the economy began recovering, the rise in job vacancies exceeding unemployed individuals signaled an overheating market, illustrating the complex balance between short-term economic support and long-term inflationary impacts. The graph shows a trend of the British pound depreciation since October 2021, primarily attributed to the ongoing economic uncertainty and repercussion from the COVID-19. The depreciation of pounds has led to a higher import prices and a consequent decline in import demand. Simultaneously, this depreciation has made UK exports cheaper for foreigners, potentially boosting export demand. This shift in trade dynamics, assuming ceteris paribus condition, contributed to an increase in net exports, which can exert upward pressure on price levels, indicating potential inflationary effects.
Central banks across the globe have long embraced the 2% inflation target as a cornerstone of their monetary policy framework. This target stimulates spending, a vital component of GDP, while allowing for signalage, a non-tax revenue from currency creation to fund expenditures without raising debt. By striking this balance, central banks aim to mitigate the risks of deflation and excessive inflation, thereby fostering economic stability. It also anchors wage and price expectations, facilitating agreements that preserve real wages, benefiting both workers and employers. However, when inflation exceeds this target, it poses significant risks to the economy. High inflation erodes purchasing power and can lead to hasty monetary tightening, which may stifle economic growth and elevate unemployment rates. In the context of the United Kingdom, the risks manifested as consumer confidence dropped sharply with rising inflation. The consumer confidence graph shows a remarkable decline in the second quarter of 2021, as evidenced by the uptick in the CPI. This inverse relationship indicates that as the CPI increases, the consumer confidence index plummets, indicating eroding trust in financial stability as inflation mounts. Inflation undermines real purchasing power, injects financial uncertainty, and when prices rise faster than wages, it compresses household budgets. This compression leads to a decline in consumer confidence, promoting a shift towards saving rather than spending, which then weakens the economy's stability. The adverse impact of decreasing consumer confidence on the UK's economy has been profound. It precipitates diminished consumer expenditure, which is a primary engine for economic expansion. Consumers delaying purchases in anticipation of continuous price hikes, resulting in reducing business revenue, potentially laying off workers that can intensify economic deceleration.
Rising energy prices, initially driven by the Ukraine-Russia conflict, have significantly influenced inflation, serving as both a cause and effect within the economic framework. This escalation, rooted in the demand-supply imbalance, has exacerbated consumer challenges, particularly in affording heating. A notable 24% of adults reported difficulty in maintaining comfortable warmth at home in early 2022, underscoring the direct impact of surging energy costs that persisted into 2022, despite initial spikes in the later half of 2021. Furthermore, the increased expenditure on energy imports demands more currency, potentially devaluing the sterling. This depreciation risks trigger a cycle of cost-push inflation, where rising costs for imported energy contribute to broader inflationary pressures, entrenching a self-perpetuating cycle of economic strain. This nuanced interplay highlights the complex dynamics at play, where geopolitical tensions and market forces converge to influence domestic economic conditions and policy responses.
Several fiscal actions by the government through 2021 and 2022 can be blamed for rising and persistent inflation. In 2021, the government began to put the economic recovery plan into action. On the tax front, the UK government was cutting taxes directly or indirectly on individuals and collectives. For individuals, rising disposable income means more consumption, while for businesses, the tax credit leaves more money to invest in R&D. Tax deductions increase aggregate demand. In the long run, however, tax relief is not a good solution to the problem. The government tax revenue decreases means that lesser capital will be attributed to healthcare, education, or infrastructure. The government also spent a lot on subsidies, national investment, and so on, leading to a large budget deficit. Evidently, the inflation was more of a cost push type due to rising energy prices, though demand was also a considerable factor given the tax cuts and rising government spending. To spur economic activity, personal income tax and corporate tax were cut to make leisure time more expensive and to encourage production in the economy. So when individuals weighed the decision to work more or not, they would evaluate the income effect and substitution effect, wherein the income effect would dictate to work more because of the absolute increase in income, while the substitution effect would make leisure time more of an opportunity cost, that is, more expensive. These policies had also had a spillover demand-side effect of increasing disposable income in consumers' hands. However, tax cuts in VAT also led to an inflow into the current account, since expenditure by foreigners would then ease the depreciation pressure but still maintain consumption. These policies in the period we studied allow us to get insights into why inflation began to spiral out of control. It must be noted that the government isn't trying to prevent inflation, as it does have certain benefits. For example, an inflation tax is something that happens when the government can earn extra tax revenue without directly taxing the public, as the same goods become more expensive for the public and they pay more. There is a similar effect on wages. If a worker has a contract not accounting for or not indexed for inflation, then the labor becomes cheaper for the firm as inflation rises, since the wages paid out are constant, while the firm can still charge higher prices to consumers due to economy-wide inflation. We saw that consumer confidence declined in early 2022. Keynesian theory tells us that expectations are self-fulfilling. Several negative shocks like COVID-19, Ukraine-Russia war, coupled with raging inflation, produced pessimism among consumers. They hence start to spend less, contracting economic activity via the C component in aggregate demand. We studied the effect on C component, which is via consumption spending, investment, which is via the investment by the firms, and G, that is the government spending. Now, in 2021, the government designed fiscal policy to enable a recovery from the damage done by COVID-19. Cutting taxes, for example, was aimed at stirring economic growth, but also meant that it was harder to finance health, education, and infrastructure. This would mean that this spending must be financed from somewhere, which ends up as public borrowing. Focusing on what happened once, it was clear that inflation started to rise beyond the desirable 2%, and the contractionary policy of raising taxes, which ultimately caused protests by public sector workers, for example, in railways.
All right, let's talk about monetary policy responses. The Bank of England raised interest rates from 0.1% to 3.5%. The biggest interest rate raise was 0.75% as inflation hit a record 11.1%. The rate hikes are aimed to temper consumption, housing activities, and affect investment employment, and exchange rates. Quantitative easing was used or was stopped to rein in the money supply and address issues of fiscal policy sustainability. As we can see in the graph, the Bank of England started to raise rates end of 2021, beginning of 2022, when inflation started to go up. So we can see a clear correlation between interest rate raises and inflation. Let's talk about the inflation snapshot. As we discussed before, the CPI surpassed 5% in November 2021, driven by COVID-19 effects and rising costs. We see incremental interest rate rises from 2021 to 2022. They were responses to economic events like the Ukraine-Russia conflict. In September 2022, we could see the bank raise its interest rates to 2.5%. Unemployment was at 3.8% at the same time. And at the end of 22, we can see another raise to 3.5%. The Monetary Policy Committee used this as a reaction to continue inflationary pressure and for policymakers and for the Monetary Committee. These rate hikes that we discussed were, of course, intended to control inflation by dampening consumer spending, slowing housing market activity, and reducing business investment. The Bank of England also utilized quantitative easing, but began to scale back these measures as a means to tighten monetary policy and reduce the money supply. Fiscal policy faced criticism for potential leading to unsustainable public finances, with calls for more progressive taxation and cautions against excessive spending. There is concern about the labor market characterized by wage rigidity, which could lead to unemployment during economic slowdowns. Our recommendations for the Bank of England and policymakers: maintain a careful balance with interest rate hikes to avoid an excessive economic slowdown, using incremental changes to match the inflation outlook. If we see inflation come down, also lower interest rates at the same time. Quantitative easing. Continue to scale back on quantitative easing with careful market communications to avoid a sudden financial market disruption. Implement gradual and targeted tax increases, particularly for higher income brackets, to address fiscal deficits without overburdening the lower income groups that tend to spend most of their income. Develop and promote policies that enhance labor market flexibility, such as support for reskilling and upskilling programs to reduce the impact of wage rigidity. Encourage private sector wage negotiations that could include non-wage benefits to avoid layoffs and manage labor costs without exacerbating this wage rigidity. Support policies that can buffer against increased unemployment, such as temporary wage subsidies or enhanced unemployment benefit during adjustment periods. Forward guidance. Use forward guidance to communicate future monetary policy actions, clearly helping to set appropriate expectations among consumers and investors. And of course, invest in sectors that can provide economic stability and growth potentials, such as technology and renewable energy, to reduce reliance on volatile sectors. And inflation targeting. Stick to a clear inflation targeting framework to ensure credibility and clarity in monetary policy, helping to anchor inflation expectations. Address supply-side constraints that contribute to inflation, such as trade barriers or supply chain disruptions, through coordinated monetary efforts and domestic policy adjustment. By following these recommendations, the Bank of England and policymakers can aim to control inflation while minimizing the negative impacts on the economy. Thank you very much for listening.